Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to week 2 Twitch chess ladder recap. Gonna still do the normal one on Friday, but this is kind of a special session. So we'll take a look at first the game between Mr. Pants at c2 and the Music Dan. Started d4 at knight f6, c4, g6. Okay, King's Indian. So in the King's Indian, as with most openings, you want to try to develop your king side pieces before your queen side pieces, because your king is closer to castling. On the king side, only needs 2 pieces to be removed. On the queen side, it needs 3 pieces to be removed. And usually your king feels safer on the king side anyway. So black is kind of playing the perfect opening for this, because he just gets himself castled in 4 moves. So white similarly wants to get this bishop out somehow, get this knight out, and castle. But first, to get this bishop out, he'll need to develop this pawn. Usually in the King's Indian, white will develop this pawn and then put this bishop on e2, rather than playing g3 and bishop g2. So this pawn belongs on e4, and to get it on e4 we need to support it. So that's why knight to c3 is the most common move here. And then after bishop g7, e4, d6 to stop e5, but it doesn't really matter. Knight f3, castle, bishop e2, e5, castle. This is the main line of the King's Indian. And as you noticed, by move 7, both sides have already developed their entire king sides and have castled. So this is kind of just the standard setup. But in this position, white played bishop to g5. So again, he's kind of neglecting his king side a bit. And also this bishop is undefended, so knight e4 can come with tempo. It's not really a terrible move, but it's definitely not the most common. So knight e4 was played, and now if white wants to avoid losing the 2 bishops, he needs to move his bishop again, either to f4 or something. He played knight f3 instead. So now black could take on g5 if he wanted to and get the 2 bishops, but he chose instead to play bishop g7. Okay, so now in this position, white should probably move this bishop. But it turns out that the best square for this bishop is actually the paradoxical bishop to c1. Idea is that if white plays bishop f4 instead, c5 is very strong, because this pawn is pinned because the bishop takes b2. So for example, after e3, queen a5 check, knight d2, knight takes, queen takes, queen takes,
check.
Queen takes, and this is actually good for black. It's actually good for black, because there's going to be pressure on this pawn after knight c6. And if white takes on a5, I mean, I can at least take on b2 and get the pawn back, and these pawns are very weak. So this is actually quite strong for black, so which is why you play bishop c1 in this position instead to defend this. So then after c5 you can play d5. And then after d5, d6 you actually want to play knight fd2. The idea being that you just want to play f3 and e4. Or just e4 right away actually. Either one. But you want to get your bishop out. And this is just the game. It's probably about equal. But notice how white has to kind of make some contortions with bishop c1 and knight fd2 just to get his pieces out normally. Instead, he makes a blunder and plays knight to b to d2. And the problem with this move is that this knight is now overworked. Knight is overworked. So after knight takes g5, knight takes g5, this just wins a pawn. Queen b3, bishop g7. And now white compounds his error by making another mistake. This is actually a really common mistake in games of lower rated players, where they see a threat and they make a move to make that threat without thinking about the consequences. So white sees that if his pawn were not here, queen takes f7 would be mate. So he plays c5. The problem with this move, though, is that black can meet it easily with castles defending this pawn, and this pawn is actually a weakness now because it's too far advanced. It has no support from its friends. This pawn is not going anywhere because of this bishop. And as you'll see by the further... Okay, so black castled to defend this, which is correct. E3, b6, good. Just trying to break open some lines. Because again, notice white has not castled yet. Bishop c4, threatening this. E6, good to just block it. f4, and now black could actually simply just take on c5 and be up 2 pawns. And black has this very simple idea to play d5, knight c6, c4, and rook c8, or rook b8. And notice that black constructs this massive pawn chain. Black's bishop is marvelous. Black's rook is marvelous. All black's pieces are really developed. And white's in real trouble. Down 2 pawns and with a worse position. Black didn't do that and played knight c6, and ended up winning after another 35 or so moves. Those moves aren't really too crucial, but yeah, I mean, black really had no trouble in converting the victory. So white kind of made a couple of opening inaccuracies and then blundered a pawn, and then c5 was kind of the last straw. He could have held on and just played on in the position down a pawn, but after playing c5, his position became far too weak. Okay, so next game we'll look at is, again, another Mr. Pants game, but this time we'll show a win. So white was Mr. Pants again, and black was Neo. Okay. So again, Mr. Pan starts with d4. Now it's d5, c4, c6, c3, d6, so Slav, bishop f4, bishop f5, e3, e6, c5, bishop e7. So this is actually all okay. I'm not going to get too much into this, but these are all actually reasonable moves. b6, b4, bc5, bc5, queen a5. Okay. So, in this position, we have to think about what to do here, because our knight is attacked. So the question is how to defend it. We don't really want to play knight to b1, for example. So white played the logical looking queen to b3, but he should have actually played rook to c1 here to defend the knight. And the reason is, after queen to b3, it's actually interesting because this queen only has one other square it can go to where it defends this knight that it's not attacked, and that's b2. Because notice a3 is attacked and c2 is attacked. So do you guys see a way that black can actually take advantage of this? It's actually a very odd move to see, but the move actually is to play rook a b8. So it looks funny because, okay, why not just take? But take, and the queen actually has nowhere to go to defend the knight. So we're going to win 2 pieces for rook here. So relatively best would be queen a4 to at least win this pawn. Queen takes c3, queen takes c6, and queen a5. Just getting your queen out of the way. And it's not easy to evaluate this position because, you know, I mean, okay, white has a pawn and a rook for 2 pieces. So normally you would think black has a material advantage of sorts, but, you know, this pawn is kind of strong. But I think black is actually better here because the rook can't come to b1. This bishop is very strong. And black kind of has this idea of slowly, eventually, you know, evicting this queen from c6, playing like knight e4, and f6, and e5, and just trying to undermine this c5 pawn. And it's hard for white to actually get his pieces on good squares. So this is kind of a tricky idea that maybe if black had even realized that he had this opportunity, maybe he wouldn't have even gone for it. But queen b3 at the very least is risky because of this possibility. So instead black played bishop d8. So he's just trying to get his bishop onto a better square, which makes some sense too. But the problem is, though, that white kind of has a great way to disrupt black's coordination here. And the way to do that is to play queen to b7. Now, the idea of queen to b7 isn't so much that we're going to capture this pawn. But the idea is more that we're basically forcing you to lose a move. Because, okay, if you take on c3, of course I'm going to take on a8. So you have to defend the rook. And the rook has no place to go, actually, because the bishop controls b8. So bishop e7 is basically forced. Notice the bishop doesn't have either of these squares because of the pawn and the bishop. And now we just play rook to f to c1, defend the knight. And if black defends his pawn with rook f c8, now knight h4, g6, bishop g6, take, and h3. And if you notice, black is kind of tied down here. Can't move this guy because the bishop would take it. Can't move this guy because this pawn would hang. Can't move this guy because this would hang. This bishop really has nowhere good to go. This queen is actually kind of stuck too. Can only really go back. And so white can just slowly kind of build pressure whenever he wants. You know, he can reroute this bishop to a different square. He can put his rook on this open file. He can maybe get a queen trade with queen a6 and then try to infiltrate on b7. But this is a difficult position for black to hold. And it's because of the fact that his rooks are disconnected and that has a space deficit. Notice that white has more space because of this pawn chain. So when you have more space, you want to try to look to make your opponent's pieces more cramped. And so queen b7 kind of forces black to huddle on the back ranks. So instead, in this position, white played knight to h4. And now there was something really tricky that that black could have played. So again, noticing that this bishop actually has a function of stopping rook to b8. Black could have played this move, g5. So it's a fork, but it's also a deflection. The deflection being that if you take on g5, I'll play rook b8, and actually this knight is now lost. Same idea as before, but now the bishop's not even on b8. The queen has nowhere to go to defend this knight. So I think both players kind of missed this idea during the game. So after g5, so bishop takes g5, rook b8. Knight b5 is actually possible. This is kind of a crazy line. But the idea is that if you take on b5, I'll take on f5 and play c6. And after knight b6, now I'll use a deflection of my own and play c7. So this is actually a carbon copy of the same tactic that black used, g5, to play c7. And again, it's a fork, but it's also a deflection because this bishop is guarding f6. So this actually is very good for white after take and take. Because all now white has to do is somehow get his queen over to the king side. So maybe just like e4, queen h3 or something. So it's kind of funny, mirror tactics there. So after knight b5, you know, it looks like a weird move, but again, there's nothing better because the knight's getting lost anyway. So the idea is that you're trying to free up the space for the c-pawn. So a6 makes more sense. But then knight takes f5, e takes f5, and a4. And this is a tricky position to evaluate. Because again, if you take here, I'll take here and get this massive pawn chain. And I have good compensation probably. Rook a7 is coming at some point. Queen b7, I can't do it right away. Because, actually I could. Because I get a new queen here. So I could actually do it right away. But in any case, this is all kind of super tricky. But it was a possibility that black had. So instead, knight e4 was played. So the idea is to attack this and attack this. So it's kind of a double attack. And I think both players just missed that this bishop was attacking this knight. Because what white should play here is take on e4. So the idea is to play knight d6 if you take here. So yeah, so if you take on h4, play knight d6 with the idea of just queen b7 and queen takes c6. And again, you can't put a rook on c8. So you'd have to take on e4 with the bishop, say. And now queen b7 again, because if you take on h4, I'll take on d7. I mean, nothing better, right? Because the rook is trapped. And, you know, bishop e7, I just take on d7 anyway. So we might as well at least take a piece. So we trade pieces. And then rook fc8 to defend the pawn. a4, queen d8. Only really square for the queen.
Check.
Take, rook takes, and bishop a6. And this is actually really good for white. Because I'm just threatening to play this and this. And there's really nothing that black can do. These bishops are super strong. And these bishops, not so much. Not so much. So white should have just taken on e4, but instead he played rook fc1 and just hung a piece, because now this is just free piece. But black missed this as well. Black missed this as well and played knight takes c3. Rook takes c3, and instead of taking a free piece, played bishop c7. So he just he played knight f4, which wasn't a terrible move, but he forgot what the reason was for playing it, which was that there's a free piece on h4. So instead, bishop c7, take, 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 take. And now, probably white should start with the move g3 here. Just because like this move f4 is what black wants to do. Because notice at this point, white's pawn chain is this f2, e3, d4, c5. So black needs to try to chip away at this pawn chain, and f4 kind of fits the bill. So say, I don't know, you play rook b1 or something. So f4 kind of fits the bill. The point being now, okay, if you take on f4, I take on f4, and now the pawn chain is d4. Much easier to attack d4 than it is to attack f2. And if you don't take, if you go, I don't know, say you go a4 or something, I take, and now your new pawn chain is e3. Much easier to attack because it's on open file. And also, I give my knight a great score on e4. Notice that my knight's not so great on e4 in this position because I can always play f3 and chase it away at some point. So, I always have to be looking out for these types of ways to kind of make targets to attack. Because, similarly, black's pawn chain is only too long. And so it's kind of easy to attack on c6. You just, play queen a4, queen a6, rook b7, and just try to get at this pawn that way. Black has a much harder time attacking f2, but if you can make the pawn chain d4 or e3, the base of the pawn chain d4, e3, it's easier to attack. So g3 kind of is a prophylactic move to stop f4. And then he can kind of continue with what he wants to do. But instead he played rook b1, rook a b8, queen c2, and now this f4 move is recommended because this pawn's attacked. Okay, queen a5 instead. So trying to trade this pawn for this pawn. Rook cb3. So again, just like g6 is fine. Because rook trades actually aren't so bad for black. This knight can help defend this pawn. And white has to watch out for like queen e1 check ideas. And g6 also removes the back rank issues. But queen a4 just kind of hangs the pawn. And then queen takes f5, hits this knight. So in this position, black had to play like rook b d8 to defend the knight. But instead, he moved the knight, forgetting that his rook was hanging. He played knight f6, and he just resigned because rook takes b8 wins the game. So a couple of missed opportunities on both sides, but they actually played the opening reasonably well. Just some subtle nuances in kind of dealing with pawn chains were missed, but notice how there were tactics. Let me remove that arrow. Notice how there are tactics on both sides involving the pawn chain. Like notice how there was these weird knight b5 ideas trying to get this pawn on c5 through, and similarly for black, notice that there was this f4 idea to kind of break up the pawn chain. So always be on the lookout for kind of unusual moves, because a chain of pawns is very hard to break down unless you kind of add something to the fire. In black's case, this f pawn, and in white's case, there were some potential sacrifices. Okay, so that was that game. Next game to look at is going to be the game between Dan and TRX. Very, very back and forth game. Let me just check the chat real fast and see what you guys are saying. I'm trying to speed through them, sort of. See the chat. Okay, so we went over 2 games. So 2 games we went over so far were just the game I went over twice, which was the game between Mr. Pants and the Music Dan, and then I went over the game between Mr. Pants and Neo. Okay, now this game is Dan against TRX. Very, very back and forth game. Okay, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and f5. Okay, so this is a gambit known as the Rousseau gambit. I don't think it's named after Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but it's the Rousseau. And it's not good. It's not good. But you have to know how to combat it. And so it's tricky because this move is actually bad. This move is actually bad because of d5. So the best ways to combat it are either to play d4, which is kind of like the most aggressive way, or to play just d3. But believe it or not, the third best move in this position is actually this move. Bishop takes g8. So this is actually a third best move. Okay, but unfortunately, white didn't play any of those. White played knight to c3. So it looks normal enough, but this is actually terrible. Because after f takes c4, now you're just losing a pawn. At least. At least. So this knight is kind of stuck. Can't go here, it can't go here. So knight g1 is probably best, but now just knight f6 with the idea of d5 is very strong. This pawn mass is going to be very good. But he took, and now d5 just wins a piece. Okay, so now if you're white in this position, you have to think to yourself, all right, well, something clearly went wrong this opening, because I'm going to be down a piece. Well, what can I do to make this more complicated, more interesting? So, do you guys see what white should do in this position to kind of muddy the waters at least and give black some issues, some problems? Okay, so the right way to do this is to actually take on e5. So let's look at black's choices. So let's look at his best move first. So black's best move in this position is to take something. What should he take? Well, he should take on e5. And now the idea is we play queen h5 check with a fork. So knight to g6 is basically forced. And now we want to play bishop takes d5. And notice we have 2 pawns for the piece. White has 7 pawns, black has 5. And this king feels a little airy. White's going to be able to castle quickly. And white has lead in development too. So knight f6, for example, forking these pieces. Knight takes f6,
check.
Queen takes f6. And okay, I mean, white has some compensation. I mean, he's worse, but you know, this king's feeling a little unsafe. He has 2 pawns for the piece. But let's look what happens if black actually makes the second best move, which is to take on c4. This seems natural. Oops, sorry. Take on c4. This seems natural, taking the bishop. But now actually queen h5 check is even stronger.
Check.
Because after g6, we can simply take. And now we're threatening all sorts of very nasty discoveries. So black's best is actually to take, and now take on h8, queen d5, f3, and bishop f5. And if you notice the material count, white has a rook for 2 pieces. It's actually a rook and 2 pawns for 2 pieces. A rook and 2 pawns for 2 pieces. So white's actually ahead in material. Black is still much better because the 2 pieces are going to be very strong. It's going to take a while for this bishop to get out, and black's going to castle. And his minor pieces will kind of rule the day. But technically white is up material here, and this was black's second best move. And if we look at black's third best move in this position, which is to play queen e7, just kind of keep everything hanging. Well, now I can actually just take on d5, take on c6,
check,
and castle. And again, I only have 2 pawns for the piece, but notice these pawns are all weak, and I have a massive lead in development. I'm just going to play rook e1, d4, do some sort of discovery, and it's actually, it's hard for black. I mean, he's still a little bit better, but it's hard, because he obviously can't take on e4, rook e1. So when you have a position like this, you have to kind of say, okay, well, I did something wrong, but how can I make it better? So knight takes e5 would have been a tricky move. But queen e2 kind of has no venom. Because after take, knight f6, there's really not much compensation here. Queen e2, bishop g4, h3, bishop f3, queen f3, queen d6. I'm not going to comment on any of these moves because they're all fine. But I'm continuing to show you the game for a specific reason. Okay, so he offers a queen trade. Probably not what you want to do when you're down a piece, but okay, whatever. Okay, so I mean, black's completely winning here. Black is just up a piece for a pawn. I mean, no issues whatsoever. So all you have to do now is black is just be accurate. So the most accurate move here is probably knight to d4, hitting c2, hitting e6. So if bishop e3, you just take and play rook d3. This bishop is entombed, and you're up a piece, so you're just going to go bishop e4 and rook d8 and pile up, and it's just over. So knight d4 ends the game almost instantly. Also, you're even threatening just to go knight e2 check, knight takes c1, and rook takes d2. I mean, anything really wins. He played bishop c5, which is not as accurate. Not as accurate. So c3 is a good move. And now all of a sudden black gets in some problems, because if you notice this bishop, it seems like it has all the space in the world. It seems like it has this space, it has this space. But all of a sudden, after rook to d6, there's a problem. So this looks natural, it's attacking this bishop, but all of a sudden this bishop is actually trapped. So if black weren't threatening anything here, white could play b4, a5 and win this bishop. Notice that these pawns are all kind of suffocating this bishop, which is why bishop c5 wasn't the most accurate move to begin with. So after bishop c4, well, now there's an issue. I'm threatening b4. So probably black's best move here is actually to play something like this. Rook d8. Just to give his bishop an avenue to get back into the game. But he kind of compounded his error with knight a5. Whoops. After bishop c4. Knight a5. And now after bishop a2, he has a problem. Because now b4 is a fork. So he doesn't have time for rook d8. And if he moves his knight, his bishop is trapped. So all of a sudden he's in issues. He has issues. So he finds the relatively best move, knight e4. b4, bishop takes f2.
Check.
Rook takes f2. Okay, so the idea now is you want to take on f2. And if you take my knight, I'll move my knight and be up the exchange. And if you take this knight, I'll play knight d3 and be up the exchange as well. But okay, I mean, white has two bishops here. And, he's certainly doing better now than he was 5 moves ago. Because two bishops are always very strong. Even though the pawns are even and white's pawns are kind of fractured, this pawn is weak and it's not so clear that black is significantly better. I mean, he's better, obviously, but not significantly. Or at least not as much as he was before. But black, I think, just kind of went into some sort of trance because he forgot to take everything. I mean, the whole point of taking an f2 was to take this rook off the board, but he just played knight c6. Now if you count the material, rook, 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 knight, knight, bishop, bishop, 6 on 6. So black just didn't take a rook. And now it's even material, even pawns, but two bishops are very strong. So white's actually just winning now. Rook e2, attacking knight, knight g3, rook e3, knight f5, rook e1, rook d3, b5, knight e7, bishop e1, and rook d5. Okay. Whoops, rook d5. Okay. So two bishops are very strong. But we need to find some way to kind of develop them. So probably here, white should just play something like bishop c2. Just kind of slowly inch forward. Eventually he might want to play like d3 and bishop a3 and rook d1. But he plays bishop takes f5, which is kind of a big mistake because why trade off your great bishop for this knight, first of all? And second of all, like, by trading pieces, you're just helping black. So, how should black recapture, though? How should black recapture? So black should actually recapture with the knight. The reason is, by recapturing with a pawn, he allows this move c4. And c4 threatens this rook, and if the rook moves someplace, say rook, I don't know, d4, trying to get a pawn back, rook takes e5, threatens the knight and the pawn. So it actually wins a pawn c4. So this is probably what white was thinking when he took on f5. He thought, okay, well, I can maybe win a pawn. But the problem is, he can take with a knight. He can take with a knight. And it looks weird to keep this pawn isolated, but now after c4, rook d4, rook takes c5, I can take on c4. And this just even pawns, and this knight's better than this bishop. So black's actually better here. Okay, but he took with the pawn. And now c4 was played. And now the rook has to basically just go back to d7 and give up a pawn. And now white's better, but it's still a bit unclear. The fact that these pawns are isolated is a bit more problematic. But it's hard to develop this bishop without hanging this pawn. I mean, obviously his knight's going to move someplace at some point. But white is better. But instead, black just blundered immediately with rook to c5. And now, simple tactics, white's move and win. Well, these pieces look like they're lined up for shooting gallery. And white executes the final blow with bishop a3. And now it's resignable. They played on for another couple moves, but after rook takes c4, bishop takes e7, white's just down or up a piece. So that's how that game ended. But very, very, very interesting game. Double-edged. Both sides made some big blunders. But credit white for kind of coming back after completely having blown the opening. So that was an interesting game. Okay, next game we'll take a look at is... we'll look at this game between Railbird and Chessick Student. So... set black name Chessick Student. Okay, so... this was a exchange character French. Okay, so this is called the Monte Carlo variation. Knight f6, knight c3, bishop e4. Okay, so this is what Railbird played in his other game against GPAC, I believe. He played knight c3, or actually in his GPAC game he played bishop d3 immediately, which was a mistake. So he learned from his mistake and played knight c3. So this is actually a line, bishop e4. Okay, so now here he's supposed to play bishop d3, and I showed this actually in that analysis. Castle, knight ge2, dc4, bishop c4. This is a line. And remember I said that now the difference is that this bishop doesn't have a good square to go to. Whereas before, it did. Or sorry, rather, this bishop doesn't have a good square to go to. Whereas before it did. Because this bishop actually wants to be on d6. But since black already played bishop e4, you can actually play bishop d3. So that's actually the main line. Also, knight f3 is playable here. But he played a3, which is actually a mistake. Because there's no need to kind of force the issue. No need to force the issue. So bishop takes c3.
Check.
That's correct. Castle, bishop d3. So this is all correct. Okay. So now the question is what to do here as white, or as black. And this is the trick. This is the trick. So, the most natural move on the board, of course, is rook to e8.
Check.
What could be more natural than developing your rook onto an open file with check? Looks great. Problem is, you have something stronger. And what you have to notice here is that this bishop is undefended, this pawn is undefended, but also this pawn is undefended. So the right way to actually play this is to play queen e8 check.
Check.
Looks weird, but the point is after knight to e2, you play queen c6. And we have a nice fork. So this pawn is now defended, obviously. It wouldn't have been if white played bishop e3. But the point is we have a fork on c4 and on g2. And this actually wins a pawn. So relatively best is queen d3. And here, black can play the move bishop f5, actually. Taking this seems a little dangerous, opening the g file. It's possible to take it, but I think it's dangerous. I think this is a little bit more exact. So if you take on f5, I'll take on c4. And if you try bishop takes f7 check, trying to win a pawn, well, you'll win a pawn, but you will lose f2 probably, because I'll play knight e4, you'll play queen c8 check. If I play rook f8, play queen e6 check. Or sorry, play d5 first, actually. And if queen takes d5, the point is you'll take on c7. But I will just play queen c4. Keep an eye on that. And then you'll play queen e6,
check.
queen h8, bishop e3, and I'll take on c3. And this is good for black, obviously. You can't play rook c1 because of mate.
Checkmate.
So yeah, probably best to just take on f5 immediately. And then, whoops, not there. Here. And this is also good for black, because notice white can't castle here. White can't castle, so knight c6 and rook e8 are coming. But queen e8's an important finesse, very important finesse. Because without it, white's actually going to be slightly better. Because these pawns are now, this pawn is now not as weak, and white has the two bishops, don't forget. But he did play rook e8,
Check.
knight e2. Okay, so now black has to think, well, white has two bishops. So one of the best ways to kind of counteract the two bishops is to trade a pair of bishops off. That's a good general rule. So a natural move would be bishop e6, which is what he should have played. Another idea black could have tried is b6, with the idea of bishop b7 and parking on this nice diagonal. And always there's ideas to play bishop d5 and kind of blockade these pawns. Both moves make sense. Bishop f5 is a bit inexact, because it looks like it's a nice diagonal, but that bishop actually gets into hot water very quickly. So bishop e6 was more exact. Castle, knight b7, knight g3, and again bishop e6 just to offer a trade. You know, at this point probably white would actually decline it. But now, you know, you try to hop into c4. Try to go knight b6, knight c4, c6. Typical play on how to play against these pawns. But he played bishop g6. Now the problem is bishop is actually in trouble after f4, because now f5 just wins the bishop. So black has to realize this and maneuver this bishop onto a better square. So probably bishop e4 is correct. Just, again, trying to get bishop d5 in. And if knight takes e4, just knight takes e4. And this is actually good for black, because c5 is... Well, actually, let me insert a move first. So he played knight b6 first, which was fine. And then he should play bishop e4. Because, yeah, if knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and the point is I want to play c5 next, and isolate this pawn. And this knight is actually a strong knight. There's nothing that can attack it. It's also hitting c3. So you probably wouldn't even want to take the bishop. So you could probably just go something like c4, then a5 and a4. And it's just a position. Now all of a sudden this bishop is kind of bad. So the reason you play c4 is to kind of discourage a piece from hopping into d5. But the negative is that now this bishop is a little bit worse. So it's probably white slightly better, but this is definitely better than what happened in the game, because after h6, f5, bishop h7, okay, well you save the bishop, but it's entombed. So in effect, white's playing up a piece. White's playing up a piece. So queen f3 attacking this pawn. Probably here, oops, this pawn. Probably should play c5 here, actually. Again, just trying to create a weakness on d4. dc5, knight d7, bishop e3, rook c8. Just, you know, just try to make these pawns weaker. Because c6 is kind of tame. c6 is kind of tame. Now white's king, or black's king side is feeling a little unsafe. Bishop f4 is strong. Just trying to go bishop e5, knight bd5, bishop e5. Okay, so here he should probably actually go bishop d2 to dominate this knight, with the idea to play c4 quickly, maybe, and then d5. You can always prepare at rook d1 first, because it's not like black can actually do something constructive. He's kind of tied down. But bishop e5 gives black the opportunity to kind of save his position. But only one way to do it. And the way to do it is to trade pieces. So how can black offer some piece trades? Well, you can do it with knight to d7. Kind of threatening to give this bishop... take this bishop. And so white really has nothing better than to take on d5, take on e5, take on d5, take on d5, take on d5. And this is actually probably close to equal. Because while this bishop is still kind of trapped, it'll be hard for white to actually, you know, get these pieces moving, because they're both kind of defending this square. And also black has a ready-made file to attack this pawn, and he can always play b6 to stop the attack on the b pawn. So he can play like rook d8, rook e8, and he's actually even attacking this pawn as well. So this is probably equal. But instead, instead of knight d7, you play queen b6, which actually loses instantly, believe it or not. So rook b1 strong, threatening bishop takes e5. So you gotta move your queen someplace. Now c4, very good, deflecting this knight so that he can take on f6. So knight d7. Or no, sorry, knight b6. Take, and now knight h5 is very strong. So the idea is you simply want to play queen g3 and queen g7 mate. Relatively best for black would be to play queen d2. And after queen
Check.
g3, queen g5, take.
Check.
Or actually, take on f6 first. Take on f6 first.
Check.
This queen is pinned. Then take on e8.
Check.
Then f6 check. First. Then rook b1. Because this queen trade is going to happen anyway. No need to force it. And this is obviously winning for white. But it's relatively best because you don't want to get mated after knight d7, queen g4. And here black resign. Because he's losing at least a piece. Probably significantly more. King f8. Can't play rook e1 right away because of rook takes. But you can just play queen g7 check.
Check.
And then you can play check if you want.